Peter is no stranger to any one of us in this room. Peter obviously has been working tirelessly on these agendas, on the agenda of competition within the marketplace, and he brings a very unique perspective with his past history. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Peter.
Can we get this to function?
Okay.
Our technologist has fled.
Yes. So, okay.
No.
This morning, when a thumb drive was pulled out, it messed up the computer.
All right.
But if
The hell with the fun.
okay, if it's okay with you, this is about as good as we get, I think, at this point. If that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. I only did the slides at the last minute, and I am an amateur slide maker, so I'm just going to talk to you.
Into that.
Yeah, I titled this slightly differently from what's in the program. I called it Deja Vu All Over Again, the past, present, and future of cattle markets. I was induced into taking an interest in competition in agriculture by a couple of my former students who asked me to come and meet with them and discuss how antitrust might be related to competition issues in agriculture. That was in the middle 1990s, and there were very serious problems then, most of which we still have today. And I continue to be involved. It's actually, for somebody well into his career, a really interesting transition to come into an enormously complicated industry. I even know something about milk market orders now. It gave a whole new life to my scholarship and work. I wound up recently publishing a book on buyer power issues, which came out of my interest in agriculture. I am, I confess, a city boy. And my father was born on a farm in Western Iowa. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, working on his uncle's farms. And I always like to say, if he'd been alive when I was getting into doing this agricultural stuff, I can just imagine him looking at me very quizzically and saying, "You, agriculture, what the hell do you know about farming?" And the answer is that I've learned a lot over the last 25, 30 years. I've learned a lot more today. I mean, that's one of the intellectually fun things about this, is there's so much to be learned. I was scribbling notes to myself again, some more things to look at, to work on. What I want to do in the next few minutes is to kind of do a tour of the history of cattle markets and beef packing, and describe to you how we've come full circle from where we were in 1920 back to even worse than 1920 in terms of our market system. And then for me, the hard question, and we've been talking about it a lot already today, is what are the paths forward? How do we make those things work? So first, the distant past, the 1920, 1919 period. In that time, there were 5 major beef pork packers: Swift, Armour, Wilson, Morris, and Cudahy. And they had between, and I couldn't find this data very clearly, but something between 60 and 70% of the interstate sales. There was a lot of local sales that were not included in that number. What were the competitive issues? Farmers were getting low prices for their cattle and hogs at the stock markets. There was a lot of manipulation of those prices. Prices would be raised, farmers would chip in, and then prices would drop. They were allocating sales. They were also manipulating other markets. I remember reading at one point in one of the reports, Mr. Armour to Mr. Swift, and they literally were Mr. Armour and Mr. Swift at the time, sending a letter saying, the price of cheese has gotten a little low. We should really go in and bid it up on the Argyle, Wisconsin, small town. But they had a cheese exchange. We should bid it up there because if they raise the price of substitutes, they're going to sell more meat to consumers. So they were doing things like that. They were vertically integrating into the operation of cold storage facilities around the country. They owned almost all the refrigerator cars necessary for shipping pork and beef. They were vertically integrating, well, they're horizontally integrating into ownership of various kinds of vegetable, dairy processing on the one side, and integrating downstream into retailing of their products. And this was resulting, well, for the 25 years prior to 1920, there were recurring lawsuits. In 1905, a major lawsuit against all the meat packers for all of their bad conduct for to farmers and to consumers. Supreme Court upheld it, but nothing much changed. Nothing much changed, nothing much changed. Lots of litigation. Finally, as a result of the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Federal Trade Commission was charged with doing a study of the industry, resulted in a 6-volume report that came out in 1919. The response to that was for the Justice Department to initiate a lawsuit. Now, you got a 6-volume report with the correspondence of the sort that I just mentioned, which was then and is now per se illegal conduct. So that there was really no question but that the meat packers were in serious trouble. They undertook to enter into a consent decree, and it's really a most remarkable consent decree. We've rarely seen one like this subsequently, in which they agreed to get out of retailing, to sell off enormous amounts of their non-beef products and accept injunctions that prohibited them from ever again selling dairy products, except for ice cream or something like that. It was very odd. They were excluded from selling structural steel, never could figure out that one, or brass ordnance. But they had to exit their ownership of the stockyards. So this was a major restructuring of the industry. Now, a minute after they signed it, isn't this typical of the meat packers? They turned around and began to sue to claim, oh no, they didn't mean to sign it, or they shouldn't have been compelled to sign it, or something like that. And it took another decade before the decree actually came into full force, although some of the provisions were being obeyed even prior to that. Congress at the same time was not satisfied with that consent decree, and that's where we get the Packers and Stockyards Act. It's adopted first and foremost initially to regulate the operation of the stockyards under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of Agriculture to ensure fairness, regulation of participation, et cetera. And then that broader authority that we all know, those provisions against discrimination, against unfairness, et cetera. First two, A and B, are clearly the equivalent of consumer protection language, comes out straight out of the Federal Trade Commission Act. The next three are really derived from antitrust law, focusing on anti-competitive conduct. And this statute, again, extraordinary authority conferred on the Secretary to write rules and regulations. And we're talking 1920, 1921. The Supreme Court of the United States was perhaps as conservative, and actually it probably had more conservatives on it than even today, and yet it was unanimously affirmed by the Supreme Court at the time. What's happening there? Oh, the one thing that I wanted to identify for you in this era were some of the conditions that made that structural situation possible. First of all, meatpacking was fairly capital intensive even then. Packing plants were large facilities, and you needed cold storage plants out and around the country so that you could, and you needed the railroad car. So you needed this fairly complex distribution system to take the pork or the beef and get it out there somewhere. And then you needed your route cars, et cetera, to deliver it from the cold storage plant. So enormous capital investment. Secondly, almost all the cattle and the hogs were being sold through the stockyards, which, if you think of a stockyard, you've got four sides to it. Where do you want to have your packing plants? You want it right there. You don't want to have to ship those animals any distance. Packers, of course, owned the stockyards, and they bought up most of the adjacent land, so that entry was very, very difficult at the time. And so you've got the vertical integration into stockyard ownership, you've got restrictions on entry, and you've got high capital barriers. And I want to come back to sort of those things because I want to jump to the post-World War II era, and especially by the 1950s. What you've got is some major change in those underlying conditions. We get the development of paved highways, and starting in the 1950s, ostensibly for national security, but I always thought it was really for moving pork and beef, we get the interstate highway system, which makes it a lot easier and faster to transport goods. And you now get the development of workable refrigerator trucks so that you can ship cattle, or you can ship carcasses, or whatever form you want to take it in much more easily. The stockyard ceased to be as significant. Once you can start shipping cattle by trucks, again, the cattle truck, in addition to the refrigerator truck, now it becomes feasible to begin to think about building your packing plant somewhere closer to the cattle. They can be trucked in, and then the meat can be trucked out again. The decree had the effect of inhibiting the major meat packers from doing the kind of expansion and occupying new spaces that they might otherwise might have had. So instead, what we got was new entry: Spencer, Iowa beef processors, which became IBP, and Montfort, and so on. You've got a whole change in the structure of that industry. Another factor that was significant is that we had federal inspection of beef, so that as a new entrant, as a Montfort or as a Spencer, I didn't have to establish the credibility of my brand. I understand, heard all of that good stuff now, but for a new entrant to be able to come in and have your beef stamped, this is exactly the same as the Swift and the Armour and the Wilson beef. Put Cudahy to one side, they were failing already. Meant that you had a kind of immediate credibility in the market. What happened? Remember, we had the big five had close to 70%. By 1977, the four largest meat packers in combination had 25% of the slaughter. So it was highly dispersed. In 1969, I wrote a memo, and I found a copy of it in my files. It suggested, recommended that we terminate the consent decree, but it didn't really seem to be very helpful anymore in terms of its in rereading that, I think I was a little overly optimistic about the state of the world. And one of the things was that I assumed in that memo, 1969, that we would have and continue to have vigorous antitrust enforcement. Forward a decade, 1981, the Meatpackers' Consent Decree is terminated. And antitrust enforcement goes into the wastebasket. So that you get that change now in enforceability. So that, again, I look back to that period that I was looking at in 1969 as one where we really had workably competitive markets. I was in 1969, actually, I went to I think it was probably the last of my father's family picnics in Iowa. And here I was, Justice Department lawyer. I had my little badge in my pocket because you never know when you're going to run into a price fixer. And my cousins are standing around talking about future prices of beef or cattle. And I'm not thinking, oh, I'm looking at a felony being committed. I'm listening to because what they were saying, they were strategizing about who to sell to, but they all had 5, 6 buyers as potential buyers for their cattle. And that meant that they really were looking at a workably competitive market. And it's interesting at that point, at least in that eastern Iowa area, prices for cattle were predicated on the grading and quality of the meat after the cattle were slaughtered, and the prices were derived from wholesale price of beef. They were all focused on what were then called the pink sheets out of Philadelphia that gave the wholesale prices. Now that turned out relatively shortly after that to become a problem because it began to, at least alleged to be, and the litigation ran from the late 70s into the 90s, that there was manipulation of those prices by the major retailers and the larger of the meat packers. A lot of those cases went away, not on the merits, but because of procedural and technical antitrust issues. The other problem that began to emerge, some of the packers still were multi-plant operators, some were not. And in the early 1980s, as some of these mergers were beginning to occur, Montfort, which had basically a single plant large operation, objected when Cargill sought to acquire Spencer that would give them even more plants and greater ability then to drive up the price of cattle adjacent to Montfort, which would drive up Montfort's costs. It's called raising rivals' costs in antitrust talk. The US Supreme Court said, no problem. This is competition. Farmers are going to get more for their cattle. Why should we care? And there's a very good dissent in the case by one justice who says, "Hey, wait a minute. There's some serious problems here we need to be aware of." So we get a failure of antitrust to pursue Montfort itself. Within a year after losing that case, sells to ConAgra, which in turn sells out to Swift, and JBS Swift ultimately emerges, and they're still headquartered basically in the old Montfort location of Greeley, Colorado. So we turn to the present. What we've got was from 1980 to through 1981, we get mergers and combinations that result in increased consolidation. You saw the thing, a slide earlier, 85% of beef now processed by 4 enterprises. So we beat the 1920 level of concentration. 2 of the leading meat packers are owned by international enterprises that are globally #1 and #2 in production. They were allowed to make entry into the market, that is to enter the American market by acquiring large firms, as opposed to telling them, hey, you want to come into the American market? You're welcome to do so. Either make de novo entry, build your own plant, or you can acquire some of the small plants and become another competitor. Instead, because of this mythology of bigness is efficiency, which is particularly inapposite in meat packing. We know that there are multiple packing plants because 3, 4, 5%